Hi, everyone. So I'm waiting about 2 more minutes before we can get started with this lecture series. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in our lecture series in Advanced Political Economy, Crisis of Capitalism, co-organized by the New School and SOAS. So first of all, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Shani Dwarka Singh. You haven't met me before this year around. So I'm a lecturer in economics at SOAS Economics. And today I have the wonderful pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, which is Dr. Alessandra Mezzadri, a distinguished scholar in the field of global development and political economy. Dr. Mezzadri is currently a reader in global development and political economy at the Department of Development Studies here at SOAS University, London. As I said, she's a distinguished scholar, and during her academic career so far, she has collaborated intensively with a lot of international development organizations, NGOs, and research centers, included but not limited to the ILO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the Global Labor University. So as you may know, Dr. Mezzadri's research is grounded in feminist political economy and provides valuable insights into the globalization of production, labor regimes, and the impact of crises on social reproduction. Her first book, The Sweatshop Regime, focuses on the Indian garment industry and sheds light on the exploitative labor relations that are inherent in global supply chains. Right now, Dr. Mezzadri is working on her second book project, Marx in the Field, which explores the contemporary relevance of Marxian analysis in global development research. Today, Dr. Mezzadri is going to present her lecture called Life in Crises, Social Reproduction Readings of COVID-19 and Caring Struggles for the Future. Following her approximately 40-minute lecture, Darren Howland, a doctoral research student here at the Department of Development Studies here at SOAS, will provide insightful commentary and engage in a discussion on Dr. Mezzadri's presentation. After Darren's discussion, we'll open the floor to our guests who are able to ask questions using the chat box in Zoom. So without further ado, please, Alessandra, you're welcome to start your lecture now. If you need to share slides, you can share your screen. Otherwise, you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Thanks a lot, Chandni, for the very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, sort of in New York, even if virtually, so that is one of my favorite places. So that's very good indeed. Marx in the Field is actually out, and I'm working at a third manuscript, which is somehow halfway through, trying to sort of grapple with the lessons that I feel I've learned and put to work exactly following from my analysis of COVID through a social reproduction lens. So I'm quite pleased to give this lecture because it helps me hopefully sort of gather my thoughts on what I think were the main lessons learned of the COVID period, on how to look at the COVID period through an SR lens. Let me see if I can quickly share my slides first. Here we go. Yes, and please, if there are any issues with the slides, if they don't move up and down with what I say, please unmute yourself and let me know, because I'm not able to see you any longer. Okay, so to give you a sense as a sort of introduction to this lecture, I have done quite a bit of work on COVID during the, 3+ years of the pandemic. We're technically still in the pandemic. The World Health Organization has not called off the pandemic period. I've done this work with the idea of trying to make sense of the type of crisis that COVID was representing from a point of view of what I work on, which is social reproduction. And that was for me very useful, because he also provided me with the possibility to then bank on this work to then proceed with what I think is the power of social reproduction in providing a key reading of capitalism as a whole. Now, if I had to choose one of the most powerful statements on COVID during the period of the pandemic, I will surely choose the words of Keeanga Yamata Taylor, when in the New Yorker in 2020 actually expressed the following: American life, they said, has been suddenly and dramatically upended, and when things are turned upside down, the bottom is brought to the surface and exposed to the light. Now, for me, these were like very powerful words, because in a nutshell, they capture our feelings towards COVID, the exposure of a number of inequalities that always characterize the capitalist system, but that in the moment of crisis, of course, become more compelling and more sort of overwhelming to see. This followed very much what proposed by Oxfam itself, then in 2022 actually put together a report where it defined the pandemic as the inequality virus, showing how it had in fact exposed a number of inequalities which were always at work, but they were just acquiring a stronger relevance during the crisis period. So now basically what really is the question is which type of crisis we looked at. And if you remember, starting from 2020, I think a lot of scholars have tried to grapple with how we can define the COVID crisis. And many have defined this as a crisis of capitalism. Many have defined it as a polycrisis. Many have tried to distinguish between a crisis that hit capital and capitalism from the crisis that hit the labor force, and so on and so forth. Through a social reproduction lens, and I think this is, the powerful prism which is provided by the framework, I would say that COVID cannot really be represented as a crisis of capitalism, but more a crisis of life. In fact, a compounded crisis of life, which I hope I will convince you of by looking at different social reproduction theorization. Now, when we talk about social reproduction, of course, we can talk about many different things. As Silvia Federici in our dossier on social reproduction has highlighted in 2019, different theorization at different points have utilized the term. Here, what I mean by social reproduction is, of course, anchored to Marxist feminist debate, and I will simply define it as all the activities that are aimed at the regeneration of life and capitalist relations at once. One, I would say, if I have to choose one of my favorite theorization of the term or definition, certainly comes from the feminist geography literature, and particularly the work of either Isabella Bacher or Cindy Katz. Now, when we talk about social reproduction, we don't talk about a theory, we don't talk about a unified framework, but we talk about a plural number of lenses which have helped us, or that do help us in the pandemic conjuncture, not only to make a sense of what is it that enters in crisis. So in particular, moving on to the next slide, which I hope you see, I would say that, as the title wants to capture, the crises that were triggered by COVID were transmitted along three different axes, whereby our life or processes of life making in general, to cite from Titi Bhattacharya, were reorganized. One is the architecture and governance of capitalist life and what we know as reproductive sectors. The second is the world of work, and the third is the political economy of death and loss, which is something that we're not used to deal with in political economy. But of course, during a moment of crisis like COVID, we were all forced to grapple with. So in the remainder of the presentation, this would be my main argument, the fact that we need to understand COVID-19 as a moment of compounded crisis of social reproduction, that we read along these three axes, and then it's only along still these three axes that lies the answers that hopefully we can have for a post-pandemic future when dealing with caring struggles or struggle for alternatives to what we've seen so far. So starting on from the first, I would say, powerful lens that is key entry points into trying to explain the pandemic and what it meant and why it sort of manifested the way it did. This first lens is social reproduction theory, which in my view is very well geared towards trying to grapple and to capture the processes of restructuring of life making that we have seen starting from the beginning of the crisis, but also how we got there in the first place. Now, if we refer to the analysis by Nancy Fraser, she has produced one of the chapters in Bhattacharya's volume Social Reproduction Theory. It's here that Fraser distinguishes provide a reading of modes of production as linked to specific regimes of social reproduction. What does she mean? It means that in each and every phase whereby production organized a particular way, we have correspondent a set of modality whereby life is also organized. Now, of course, we can see this applying to the difference between feudalism and capitalism. In fact, already Silvia Federici have done a huge amount of work on this, but particularly Fraser pays attention to this correspondence between different phases of capitalist accumulation and different regimes of social reproduction. So a sort of intra-capitalism, if you want, theory of how reproduction organizes and reorganizes. She distinguishes particularly three regimes of social reproduction. And the third is the one that she pays particular attention to, and is the neoliberal reproductive regime, characterized by marketization of welfare and reproductive services and the financialization of the economy. And also we will see, not through just their work, but other people's work, the financialization of all other reproductive activities. Now, the marketization and financialization of life that takes place starting from the neoliberal regime has a slightly different trajectory in the global north and the global south, or at least it has different names, we'll see. And we make a lot of reference to austerity in the global north, with the cuts in welfare and public expenditure, while instead we have the rolling in of structural adjustment programs in the global south, defined quite famously by Diane Hunt as a double shock therapy, because they involved both a repressive monetary as well as fiscal measures. Now, reading Isabella Bakker and Beverly Mullings, working specifically in North America and in Jamaica, they highlight how the neoliberal reproductive regime involved the reprivatization of social reproduction or reproductive services, and of course triggered a number of crisis, reproductive crisis, because of this systematic creation of care gaps. Now, the neoliberal state, both in the north and in the south, is a very slim state, and gaps in welfare created by this withdrawal of public expenditure and public spending, of course, manifests itself with the creation of care gaps. Now, if these gaps were socialized by women in certain contexts, then, of course, particularly in the global north, this also are created in a context of a rising incorporation of women into the labor force, and hence we have that the resolution of these gaps takes the outlook of the formation of global care chains. So the households, particularly in the global north, becomes net purchasers of reproductive work and reproductive services, as they become increasingly sort of sites for the accumulation of debt. And there are a number of other scholars that work on social reproduction and household debts that is worth mentioning here, like Adrienne Roberts or Jonna Montgomery, among others. Now, while the household is crucial to this process of reorganization of life that's triggered by neoliberalism, so are reproductive sector, because of course the roll back of the state from public spending also means massive cuts in the context of these particular sectors. And these have massive knock-on effects, because of course it means that there is a mainstreaming of the logics of global care chains also in health and education. And of course, different feminist scholars have mapped the implications of these processes of reconstitution of sort of provision of reproductive work in the north, which was in a sense a net intaker of these services, and in the south, which was instead the supplier. So as Nicola Yeats, for instance, highlights the impact of these processes on UK NHS, you have Salima Valiani instead that maps the impact of this brain drain in terms of reproductive resources in the global south, for instance, in part of Africa. Now, crucial to this process of reorganization was, of course, the privatization of this sector, or at the very least, the creation of the mainstreaming of models of private-public partnerships, which start being utilized very heavily, both in health and education. Sonia Langhil, for instance, has done a lot of work on education across different parts of Africa, showing the limit and the perils of these processes of privatization. And at the same time, of course, this has also gone on massively in health. And you have people that have written about this in particular, like Jasmine Gideon, for instance, but it's something that we see really emerging in all its sort of chilling effect during COVID. And again, I have to say that whilst we have very different geographies that we can map between the global north and the global south, this logic of privatization of life in what are key sectors for our regeneration of people, health and education actually is very clear that take place, albeit with different pace, very much across the board. My son, the very own nursery, for instance, it emerged clear to us during COVID that it was owned by the credit agency down the road. And as a matter of fact, there is a very interesting report by colleagues at UCL, among whom Helen Penn, that have highlighted the process of corporatization and financialization of the early years sector in this country, whereby you have massive concentration from a few giants in the sort of sector of British nurseries. So that, you know, you actually bring in your child in one of the hub of financial capital without even knowing, in the under 3 years of age category. Now, this is very important because COVID hits in the context of this particular type of reorganization of life. So as neoliberalism has transformed the way we live in this fashion, it is in this moment that COVID hits. So in a sense, it hits in a moment already of crisis of life due to the ongoing reorganization that have gone on now for decades. Now, in this context, it's really not surprising to spot how you have the highest death toll from COVID, unlike the health system that struggle more, are exactly those that are characterized by privatized healthcare. Now, again, you have a change in geography of what privatized healthcare means, in a sense that you have systems like the United States, where there is fully privatized healthcare, and you have a sort of quite strong positive correlation with high death rates. And you have Peru at the same time, which is, you know, poster child of neoliberal restructuring, in a sense that up to the beginning of COVID, it was growing at double-digit figures. And these are places where the death toll has been really, really high within their respective regions. But also you can see this in the context of healthcare systems, which are public, but whereby significant segments in relation to A&E or in relation to specific health services have been privatized nonetheless. And this is the case of the NHS in the UK, but also there are others that discuss, for instance, the Italian North, which is considered to be a center of excellence, but there's massive level of private capital entered. And these are still pockets where you see higher levels of death. So you can see a correlations between the pockets where you find a higher level of privatized services and this ultra lethality, if you want, of COVID. And despite the clear evidence of the failures of public-private partnerships, you have to sort of understand that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund reacted to COVID through further support on these particular schemes. So much so that, as mapped by Urania Dimaku and other colleagues in SOAS Economics, by the time that the bank formed its COVID relief fund in 2020, already after a few months, half of the total fund actually was channeled towards private intermediaries in healthcare. So the neoliberal resolution, if you want, of the crisis made more lethal by neoliberal healthcare has been some more neoliberal healthcare. And as of today, if you look at scholars who specialize in tracking and tracing the trends in which sectors are becoming more financialized and are considered to be the biggest sites in terms of tradable assets, you'll find healthcare being one of those. And of course, the politics of vaccine starting off with COVID has had a significant impact on this as well, with of course a lot of shortcomings of who had access then through to vaccines in this particular system that has emerged since COVID, and which feminist economists like Jayati Ghosh has defined as a system of vaccine apartheid. So this is already one lens which is crucial for us to understand what I mean with the crisis of life when I try to highlight the key features of COVID-19. But there are also other two lenses that we have to consider, the second of which is the reorganization of the world of work, or like some, if you want, key insights on the world of work, which COVID-19 has unveiled massively, and where another lens of social reproduction help us navigate. And this takes us back to early social reproduction analysis. Now, we know that, one of the most currently known frameworks analyzing social reproduction is indeed social reproduction theory, but we also know that these are debates that start in the 1970s with the domestic labor debate and with insights of authors like Silvia Federici, Leopoldina Fortunati, Selma James, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, and others that actually started working on the value-producing nature of reproductive work, of the type of work that took place in the household. Now, also these insights have been really crucial to understand the type of crisis that COVID triggered on life in the last years, up to when we managed to exit our houses. Now, on the one hand, when COVID hit, it seemed to be the biggest validation of Marx' insight that labor generates all value, because we removed labor from the cogs of the system, literally, because we couldn't mingle, we had to stay home. And the ILO estimated that 255 million full-time equivalent jobs were lost just in the first part of 2020. So a crisis really like no others. On the other hand, however, he also validated very much the sort of remarks and observations of the early social reproduction feminists that have always stressed the fictitious nature of the divide between productive and reproductive work. COVID restructured, in fact, massively this divide, and almost overnight, if you think for people like us, no, and we still like running on Zoom, which was something unimaginable until a few years ago. Now, of course, this reorganization was very biased and was very different across the global North and the global South, with the global North that could if you want, re-insource in the home a number of key white-collar services, academia being one of this, and colleagues at the ILO, like Janine Berg and others, that calculated that across the global North, up to 30% of all jobs could be insourced in the home. While instead in the global south, it's a totally different ballgame, because we already had a very sort of fuzzy divide between the productive and the reproductive, if you consider the high level of informal employment, which characterize these economies. Up to almost 70% of total employment in the global south is informal or informalized in nature, according to the ILO last estimates per region 2018. So here was trickier, but in a sense, it was clear how fictitious these divisions that we apply to the world of work actually are. And also it was clear how other fictitious divisions can actually be applied. So for instance, during the pandemic, the rise of debates around essential work were, in a sense, the new frontier where work dichotomies actually formed. And colleagues, again, in economics have shown, and actually also colleagues at Goldsmith, like Sarah Farris, have shown how tricky these new dichotomies also are. Sara Stevano, Rosimina Ali, and others have shown how we have a very different take of what constitutes essential work around the globe, across the global north and the global south. Please do not just write on my slide just yet as I finish reading. And others instead highlighted how this jargon of essential versus non-essential work actually could lend itself to sort of quite dangerous pathways with certain jobs considered to be non-essential that could lead, for instance, to retrenchment, or even the manipulation, if you want, right, of who is essential or non-essential work for employers to wash their hands over how family reorganize their own social reproduction. This is something, for instance, that happened to us academics here at SOAS as well. Well, in the old sector, because that all of a sudden the then Prime Minister announced academic jobs as being part of essential work, and at that point you have to renegotiate. Those of us that have kids had to renegotiate with our local schools if we wanted to send children at home, but basically it was seen as a way to deny people furlough. Now, what also is crucial and about the early social reproduction lessons and how they inform how COVID has to be understood as a crisis of life is the fact that it was very clear throughout COVID how unpaid and informal care work massively sustained the process of valorization during the pandemic itself. So it revealed, really, these forms of labor revealed their central role in processes of labor surplus extraction and value generation. And you have pretty much, on this particular point, you have pretty much evidence across the global economy. You have in the UK, the denial to women of over 70% of the total furlough application across 2021, because women have to be at home and sort of reabsorb the provision of education for children. And at the same time, you have instances well discussed by feminist economists from India to Southern Africa, whereby informal, feminized economies were crucial to sustain life, whereby the state could not actually arrive. So you have, for instance, reports by the work of Bina Agarwal in Kerala describing how a community kitchen set up by gendered informal economies were crucial to sustain life in that period. You have the work of Linosome that looks at the different ways in which informal economies work across Africa and substituting for state action in a context where the state could not, in fact, reach people. You have the work of Veronica Gago and Lucy Caballero in Argentina that explain the ways in which economías populares actually sustain the process of life making in this period, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, you do really see how the lens of early social reproduction analysis is able to capture the transformation that we have seen in the realm of work during COVID. And so a second key lens to understand and interpret the crisis as a crisis of life. Now, the third, I have to say, we were not ready for. I was not ready for sure. And in a sense, it's a greatly, I would say, insightful analysis whereby we analyze social reproduction, learning from racial capitalism analysis. And here I benefited tremendously from the work of Gargi Bhattacharya, who's one of the first, I would say, that in her book Rethinking Racial Capitalism actually address the interconnections between social reproduction and processes of racialization and their implication for capitalist life. Now, we've never seen, I have not seen, I have to say, in my lifetime, the process of management of large-scale death as we could witness during COVID, and it was quite chilling indeed. And what the analysis framed around social reproduction through a racialized lens actually allow us to brainstorm around is a key question that we never address in political economy. That is really who dies of capitalism. Now, if you look at both social reproduction theory and early social reproduction analysis, they start from a question vis-a-vis life, right? So the questions they pose and they answer partially in similar ways, partially in different ways, is who generates life, who produces the worker in a context where we produce commodities under capitalism, so well explained by many political economy frameworks. Who produces those who produce? So these are the key questions that they pose, but they don't pose the question of who dies within the system, who is disposed of within the system, which instead, I would say, analysis, feminist analysis framed on racial capitalism, or feminist analysis framed around ideas of coloniality and decolonization. For instance, also François Verge's recent contribution on decolonial feminism instead address. And COVID actually really compelled us, if you want, to grapple with this particular question, because it was very much before our eyes who dies first and which were the differentials in death rates which we have seen, which also in development studies, I think, is an issue which has been explored by many authors dealing with the effect of colonization, or indeed neo-colonization, for instance, Tanya Lee among others. Now, the ways in which COVID has enable us to understand the crisis we were going through as a crisis of life, which you can study through death, I would say had different nuances, because in a sense, we were before multiple processes of surplus life formation, in a sense. You have seen during the unfolding of COVID, the creation of multiple types of surplus populations, and in ways that really exceed how political economy has classically dealt with the issue of surplus population. First, because political economy generally engages with the idea of surplus population through the lens of labor. And secondly, because it generally does not necessarily address death as part and parcel of its analysis. What this instead analysis centered on social reproduction and capitalism have been able to provide us with is an insight into what the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe has called as the necropolitics of capitalism, which it's also a window, if you want, into the afterlives of certain processes which have very long histories in capitalism and before that. Now, through the lens of racialized social reproduction analysis, we can identify multiple types of surplus population. One type of surplus population is quite sort of crudely the death. So if we look at death rates and we look at who died and how within COVID-19, we already start learning a number of chilling answers to our question. And particularly in former imperial and former settler colonial states, where we do have disaggregated data per ethnicity, a very sort of clear picture emerged through the analysis carried out by the Lancet or by the British Medical Association. So we're dealing with quite legit data here. And they highlight, particularly for the UK and the US, but they're just data also from South Africa, anecdotal evidence for India and other countries, that marginalized communities died at a much higher speed than other communities. Black people in the United States, different people of color in the United Kingdom were dying at the faster pace than their white counterpart, something that actually the very medical association dealing with this data have to grapple with and accept that could not be explained as an outcome of comorbidities alone. So the idea of these being diseases of poverty. This because it was a compounded effect also of the exposure of many of these communities and these populations to processes of work which had exposed them to a higher level of contagion, and where you really have a sense of how depletable work might become. And for the US, a lot of scholars have highlighted, for instance, linkages with what Sadia Hartman, among others, have called the afterlife of slavery. So in a sense that you have the same communities that are across times still exposed to socialize the crisis over their bodies in ways that are more than exponential based on, of course, their exploited past. Now, the dead being the first type of surplus population, then we have a more classic type of surplus population, that is a constitution of the reserve army of labor that Marx talked about, with the difference that the type of reserve army of labor that we have seen during COVID was, of course, a very particular reserve army of labor that could perform work that was considered to be essential for all of us to stay at home and survive that way. So in a sense, there has been this amplification of what we can call as a reservoir of reproductive labor, essential work. I don't know what you did in the US. In the UK, we clapped for them every Thursday, now that we pay them more. And Kawashima, I would say, has captured the features of this particular reserve army as one that is indispensably disposable. So that you have jobs that were performed by particularly vulnerable communities, gendered and racialized, and at the same time, of course, they were still paid very poorly, and where people were still highly depletable. And again, there's key connections that we can do with our colonial past. So, for instance, other feminist political economists like Bridget O'Loughlin, they have highlighted the connections between the longue durée of these connections between labor regimes and what she calls the production of affliction, so death via different types of epidemics that she has traces, for instance, with reference to the Southern Cone. So in a sense, you do have this connection between death rates and the type of processes of work which we have seen, and their racialization and particular gendered nature. Finally, we also have liminal populations, so what we can call the rejects, right, that have been emerging as a particular type of surplus life or surplus population, which we generally don't grapple with in political economy, because we're more concerned, as I said, with processes of work. But instead, I would say that even their representation, well, their abandonment during COVID tells a hell of a lot over how we reorganize life during crisis and where we channel the majorities of the resources. And if you remember, at the beginning, debates were around the elders, and then but there are a number of other liminal populations that were considered to be very much at the margins of the type of reorganization of life, and also the vaccination, also the vaccination programs that started at the beginning, at the end of 2021. Now, one of the readings for today put it quite starkly, right? If you look at the vaccination rates for Palestinians, which I think epitomize liminal population per excellence, during the period where 4% were in Israel, instead, the vaccination rates already scored 60%. So that is really the epitomization of what covering a liminal position actually means. They were just massively exposed, more exposed to death during COVID, something which speaks about the type of social death that they already experienced even before the contemporary attack. Now, as Marx talks about surplus subjects as crucial to capitalism, I would say that also these other subjects that we can read through a social reproduction lens as surplus populations have to be recognized in the key function that they have also performed within capitalism. So the idea that these populations are redundant to capitalism, which has been put forward by several, I would say is incorrect, because in a sense, their being spendable still has a disciplining effect on the rest. This is something, for instance, migration scholars have written a lot about. The spectacle of death always have an ordering, disciplining effect overall. And so even this population covering this liminal role have sort of had a key role to play during the crisis of life that was constituted by COVID. Now, so these three lenses of social reproduction allow us to understand COVID as a compounded crisis of life, as opposed to a crisis of capitalism, but they can also guide us towards a post-COVID sort of reconstruction, or like what we mean with the post-COVID agenda and politics after what we've seen in the last years. And this is, for me, a fundamental aspect of why mobilizing theories of social reproduction to reinterpret and reanalyze the history of capitalism is so important, because theory is always political. So the beauty of and the power of this reading is that it provides us with a mapping of areas of interventions to imagine the future as different from what we have experienced. So, of course, the answers again run through these three different levels of analysis, or three different lenses of social reproduction theorization that I try to convince you of today as working particularly well to explain COVID as a crisis of life. So the first, of course, is to re-engage debates towards what it means to move to a caring economy. So to transform the reproductive infrastructures that have been completely hacked and privatized and appropriated by the neoliberal project, to reclaim those infrastructures in ways that return welfare where it belongs to the people. So, of course, this is a project that can have different types of elements or features in different contexts, but we are talking about either renationalizations, or you're talking about public provisions of different types, you're talking about commoning of different types. What it will look like, of course, depends on the politics of the specific region we discuss. But what is evident is privatized forms of reproductive infrastructures not only have not worked, but they've led us to a place whereby a pandemic has turned even more lethal than it would have been otherwise. So that is, of course, the first area of intervention for politics and policy. The second concerned the words of work. And
sorry, Alessandra, to interrupt, but could you wrap up in about 2 minutes?
Yes, this is the last slide. Yes. So the second is the interventions on the word of work, which focus on different forms of care income. Now, a lot of the literature has been very critical with the essential work and what is represented, and I would agree. But debates around essential work have also been strategically repositioning the relevance of care and caring as a key type of labor. And this must lead to debates around wage support for those engaging in these particular activities, which might border sort of demands for basic income or not, but that is, to me, semantics, because ultimately, who doesn't have a wage at all, an income demand is a wage demand. And again, there are differences of the case, of course, regionally. And finally, of course, centering race and gender oppression in policies in ways that move debates from ideas of economic efficiency to economic justice, and whereby inequality debates are reframed away from income indicators to instead start with the existential nature of inequality, which is what precedes then its income manifestation, something that too often we forget in political economy. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Alessandra, for that great presentation, very thorough exploration of this theory and how it has manifested itself throughout the pandemic and after the pandemic. So now I'm going to invite Darren to present her discussion on your presentation. You have about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. But yeah, firstly, thank you, Ale, for that really brilliant analysis and kind of insight and look into kind of the world of social reproduction theorizing and kind of the different tools and insights it offers us for understanding not just kind of the pandemic or moments of crisis, but, you know, capitalism and life under capitalism itself. So I'll start by just kind of first highlighting some of the key points that you've made and reflect on their kind of significance or key contribution to our understanding of capitalism and the logic of crises under capitalism, and then kind of pose some questions in relation to kind of the political implications of the social reproduction analyses, how we can kind of heed these insights in the service of building kind of, you know, a progressive post-pandemic politics, and kind of move beyond that pandemic neoliberalism, which you were kind of, you know, getting into at the end there. So yeah, I think the kind of the framing here of the planetary crisis brought on by COVID offers a really interesting vantage point to, you know, understand the ways that processes of social reproduction are inextricably linked to processes of capital accumulation. As you say, kind of using crisis as a method or a magnifying glass is a really powerful way to kind of uncover the inequalities and vulnerabilities that kind of constitute life under capitalism, and which are, you know, amplified in these moments of crisis. So in the context of the pandemic, where, you know, social distancing becomes a newly enforced public health imperative, we see in the disruption of social life under capitalism, kind of the essential function that social relations play in maintaining regimes of capital accumulation, and also the centrality of human labor to the production of value. So really beyond just the more kind of temporary crisis of capitalist production that we see in the initial months of the pandemic, we see, you know, how the pandemic led to this systemic crisis of social reproduction and a crisis of life, as you say, kind of rather than a crisis of capitalism. So kind of rather than a shift in the mode of production or a change in class relations, we actually see kind of a deepening of the logics of neoliberalism, which you've coined, you know, pandemic neoliberalism. So we can see through the pandemic the ways that these processes of social reproduction and life making are inextricably linked to processes of capital accumulation, and the ways that capitalist crises or capitalist contradictions kind of resolve themselves through the scraping of value from the realm of social reproduction, and therefore, you know, draws our attention to this centrality of life-making activities for the working of capitalism, as well as the value of care and these inequalities in relation to care faced by particular communities and individuals kind of around the world. And so, yeah, I think this also kind of brings our attention to the ways that the dynamics and outcomes of crises under capitalism are experienced in ways that are highly classed and gendered and racialized, and the need for us to kind of reflect more concretely on what are the kind of central aspects of crisis and for whom, and what this implies for kind of the boundaries and horizons and terrains of anti-capitalist struggles. So just to highlight kind of a few key points here. First, I think kind of one of the main contributions you've made here is to recognize and delineate the kind of plurality and distinctiveness of social reproduction theorizations, and the importance of emphasizing kind of the diversity within social reproduction approaches, given that theorizing on social reproduction is often misrepresented as being kind of homogenous. So your intervention here in drawing out very kind of explicitly this distinctiveness of these different social reproduction lenses, and what each specific lens kind of allows us to understand, both in the context of COVID and beyond it as well, about life under capitalism and the reproduction of capitalism, which is really important, especially for thinking about how the crisis and how capitalism in general kind of manifests differently and has different characteristics across the global north and global south, for example. And so, as you noted, definitions of social reproduction kind of either place emphasis on processes of societal regeneration or stressing the links between kind of paid productive or unpaid reproductive labor. So I think it's important to kind of emphasize this definition that kind of blends together these two aspects and sees kind of or stresses the role that social reproduction plays both in making life and capitalism. So the way that you kind of draw together these three lenses of social reproduction theory, so looking at the reproductive architecture of neoliberal capitalism, and then the early social reproduction analyses kind of focusing on the world of work, and then these raced social reproduction approaches, so kind of the manufacturing of surplus populations, which capture kind of distinct but overlapping and complementary features of the crisis of capitalist life during COVID, is really useful for kind of understanding the regeneration of capitalist relations and our kind of struggles against them. So I'll just offer a few quick kind of reflections and then questions kind of scaffolded around those three different lenses that you mentioned. So I'm thinking with regard to social reproduction theory in relation to the kind of governance of life-making sectors. So you've drawn on Fraser's work on, regimes of social reproduction, which help us kind of trace these processes of commodification and commercialization of the reproductive sectors that kind of characterize the neoliberal era, with the kind of externalization of care responsibilities onto communities, that reprivatization process, and kind of drawing out how the regime of social reproduction in the neoliberal phase is kind of already prone to these crises of care, with the hollowing out of the public sector, externalization of care, the erosion of labor rights, et cetera. So again, this kind of reorganization of social reproduction of life under neoliberal capitalism kind of demonstrates how processes of social reproduction are, again, inextricably linked to capital accumulation processes, and how these, contradictions and capitalist crises resolve themselves through this scraping of value in the realm of social reproduction, both through kind of waged and non-waged routes. So as you say, this kind of link between production and reproduction has important political implications for how we struggle and organize against capitalist exploitation. So I wonder if you can kind of reflect a bit more on this idea of the boundary struggles or reproductive struggles, in addition to or alongside the class struggles. So what can we kind of learn from this broadening of our view of anti-capitalist struggle to not just class struggle over the distribution of kind of surplus between capital and labor in the productive sphere, but also the boundary struggles over this division between production and reproduction, and kind of who bears the costs of social reproduction, given that reproductive labor as either low wage or unpaid labor is usually borne by the most marginalized in society. So what does this kind of look like in practice in terms of our demands and the horizons and the different terrains of anti-capitalist struggle, and who we kind of define or confer political agency onto in waging anti-capitalist struggles? And what are the kind of practical challenges that these types of reproductive struggles face in the post-COVID context? And then kind of also looking at kind of thinking more concretely about the social differentiation of the laboring body. So to take, as you do, the language of Federici, we can see how, studying the labor of social reproduction kind of revealed how the concrete kind of social of capitalism is co-constituted by gender, race, and other, forms of social differentiation alongside class. Now, there's lots of kind of debate around kind of different theoretical traditions about the best way to conceptualize the impact of and relationship between these kind of different forms of social differentiation. So I wonder if you can reflect a bit more on how you see kind of the specificities of these different dimensions of social difference, and how we can conceptualize or develop an understanding of how or if it all fits together, and what specifically a social reproduction lens can help us do in parsing out the relationality between race, gender, and class, and the role that they play kind of within the systemic functioning of capitalism. So I'll pause there to kind of let you discuss, and then we can either come back or kind of move forward with the Q&A.
Thank you, Darren. Alessandra, if you'd like to respond to the questions or discussion points posed by Darren before we head into the Q&A.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Darren. That was a fantastic commentary. And I'll start with your query vis-a-vis boundary struggles, which I find something that I find myself reflecting on. Indeed, if you look at Fraser conceptualization, that is how, of course, she would put this particular issue because of the very characteristics of her framework. So you have basically a particular regime of accumulation, you have a regime of social reproduction, and because any regime of accumulation tends to cannibalize, if you want, so as she says quite clearly more recently, the type of reproductive arrangements on which it is based, then you have this particular type of struggles that take place. Now, my reading of that, exactly because I try to read capitalism through multiple social reproduction analysis from the point of view of life at different entry points, is that to me, we can call them boundary struggles, but I'm happier with the idea of reproductive struggles. So what we do have is a multiplicity of reproductive struggles, which we see, that we can map. And a lot of these reproductive struggles are ways in which different groups of people try to put forward or stake in their own claims vis-a-vis different processes that might be reappropriation, might be a redistribution, or might be against oppression. But in a sense, to draw a line between what is boundary or what is where the boundary lies, I find it really tricky from my own perspective. While instead looking at this as reproductive struggles allows me to sort of, in a sense, start from the type of claims that are staked by different people. And of course, part of my work is trying to sort of highlight how we all value subjects under capitalism. So in a sense, all struggles are partly related with processes of opposing to processes of extractions that might manifest differently. So yes, I think in some cases you can benefit from sort of looking at which struggles trying to reclaim from the point of view of the field of reproduction, but ultimately my answer would be that all struggles are reproductive in nature, and many are of labor and laboring in nature. The second is related to social difference or like social oppression and its relation to class formation. And of course, for me, that is a relation of co-constitution. So I think on that is an area where I do feel that social reproduction feminism has a lot in common. So as we have in common with the best sort of tradition of intersectional analysis by feminists like Imani Banerjee and others. So we're really talking about the same thing. You might come from intellectual traditions where your accent is different, but I think that is a lot to bank on in terms of commonalities from our approaches. The fact that you have to interpret class as sort of an outcome of raced, gendered sex processes, whereby you cannot really have a distinction between exploitation and social oppression, but you should actually look at the continuities and processes of co-determination between this particular categories. So that would be my answer to you, which I hope satisfies you.
Okay, great. Thank you both. We can now head into the Q&A session. Patrick Levine has his hand raised up. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and then you could ask a question if it is a question that you have. There is also a question in the chat, Ale, that you're probably able to read, and you're free to respond to that question as well. Go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, hi there. I have a question about the U.S. experience with the child tax credit. I was on a Poor People's Campaign call, and it was right at the moment when the child tax credit was being phased out. And we had people from 15 different cities talking about what the experience was of the families that were losing that tax credit. Apparently, the data shows, and there was good national data on this, that it cut child poverty in half. And it was only in effect for less than 24 or 28 months, 26 months. But when it ended, people who had relied on it to pay their electric bills and their water bills and stop the cutoffs and to avoid eviction and to get car repairs so they could get to work were just put into this massive crisis. And I was listening to people telling those stories, and teachers and social workers in inner city schools and in rural schools, and telling all the stories of the families put in crisis. I just wondered if you could take that one small example of a child tax credit in a major Western country that did such a dramatic reduction in child poverty and just totally stabilized families in the most basic ways, and just comment on that in light of all these incredibly helpful ways of thinking about it, but just with that one small example. And why didn't they continue that tax credit? I mean, it was such a tiny part of the budget, and it would have made families' well-being go off the charts if it had been made permanent. I don't understand it. Can you just comment on that?
I wish I had the comment that can answer your question, Patrick, because of course we see that over and over again. We see it with tax credit, we see it with family checks, we see here in the UK, same difference with free school meals. So you have this interventions which everybody agrees will cost very little in the budget, but instead will have such an amplified effect. They're not chosen as instead the ways forward. I think you can read it in very different ways, but the idea is which type of society is neoliberal society. and is one whereby welfare is not looked after, is not provided by the state at all, and it's a vision whereby instead the generation of or like the socialization of welfare disbursement by family and by communities is seen instead as the productive way to go forward, as opposed to what instead we all know that it's you know, it's a vehicle of amplifying poverty. So I don't really have a good answer for you. I just totally agree that you see these measures implemented, and it's even sort of for me more heartbreaking to see this the implementation of certain measures post-COVID, as after we have seen first the effect that certain actions can have, but also after all that we learned during COVID. We just, I sometimes feel that we have already forgotten everything about what we went through. So I just really don't have a right answer for your question. I'm just as outraged as you are.
Thank you, Ale, and thank you, Patrick. Ale, would you like me to read out the questions in the chat and then so you can respond, or do you want to address them as is in the chat?
I have a question on necropolitics and a question on the concept of crisis. And okay, so in terms of necropolitics, Sneha is asking me, what seems chilling to me is that capitalism benefits from the indispensable population, wherein welfare state have fewer mouths to feed. Here too, capitalism and the push for neoliberalism wins. Well, yes, I think it's a very much linked to Patrick's consideration, but in a sense, it's also how you see these processes as linked to actually push people out there and to sort of trigger constant process of impoverishment, as if it really was ongoing primitive accumulation, whereby you release resources for people then to go out there and work. So this was crucial during COVID, to have people that had to go out, that had to seek work, that have to expose themselves to necropolitics if they wanted to survive, because a lot of people simply did not have the luxury of staying at home because their work could not be insourced. I'm talking about gig economy workers, warehouse workers, all those that actually knitted the very complex, thick fabric of life making on which our survival was based on during COVID. So I guess it's not just a question of having fewer mouths to feed for the welfare state, but the pushing for processes that release resources and laboring resources out there that have to work for cheap, that have to sort of labor for very low wages, and these having been the people that then were more exposed to contracting the disease. Luisa, on the concept of crisis, if we are overusing the concept of crisis, I think we are overusing it if we focus on these moments as crisis of capitalism. I don't buy this sort of concept any longer, especially if you look at what really characterized the neoliberal project, right? The level of inequalities, the type of people that get massively rich out of that, the type of ways in which we organize production and work. None of them has really changed substantially after an initial period of reorganization during the pandemic. In fact, if you look at sort of the upper elite strata, if something has benefited enormously throughout the pandemic, you have rise of polarization of income in the top 1%. Some people did extremely well, of course, Bezos, because we're all at home buying from Amazon, but a bunch of others. So when it comes to mobilizing the concept of crisis of capitalism, I agree with you. And I would say that something similar we can say with regard to the financial crisis, right? Because, I mean, it was hardly socialized by capital. But if we look at instead at the concept of crisis of life, I do think it's powerful because we died more, we died faster, certain people faster than others. We just have to intensify our labor. We have to sort of reinforce unpaid labor in services and educational services as women. We had to go out there, many of us, to labor, even if the infection was spreading. So from the point of view of life, the fact that there was a crisis is quite compelling. I think there is another question in the chat. Yeah. Okay, so it's a question around universal basic income. Okay, so in the global south, basically the question is to what extent universal basic income is an answer, but also that in the global south, some answers were based on the solidarity economy and commoning and so on and so forth. Please tell me if I'm misrepresenting your comment. But basically, of course, I definitely pro basic income. I would never be against a social policy for the poor. So I never understood people from the left would pitch themselves against a pro-poor policy. It's really difficult to sort of sell as an argument. And I just would like really these people to reflect very carefully on why they like to pitch themselves this way. This said, I think basic income is part of a package of disbursement that I see as necessary. It's certainly part of how people survive during COVID, some of them. But I would say that what we've seen in terms of transformations in the world of work, or even functioning of the world of work through the crisis, calls not just for basic income, but it calls for a recognition of the labor offered by certain people, which is not valued as labor and is not waged or is not given a wage as different forms of labor would be. So these are two slightly different claims. The claim that basic income can serve a purpose, and instead the fact that we should recognize unpaid labor in services for the value generating aspect they bring, and we should basically reward them. So I don't see these two as the same project. It's not a rival policy project, but it's not exactly the same thing. And of course, we talk about all of this within a context where we need to reclaim our welfare. So you don't only talk about these measures without thinking about the provision of real services, because otherwise it turns out to be a financialization of a right. And whenever we monetize a right only without working on the broader architecture, we lose that right because it's just so exposed to the market vagaries of the case. In terms of the solidarity economies, I'd like people not to really romanticize what is going on, because it's true that you have a lot of this amazing sort of representation of common kitchens and economia populares, but that was based on survivalism. So I would not want this to be a debate around how commoning is great, because a lot of people put a lot of work in that, and because it was a crisis moment, but many of them did not see rewards by the state, and many of them actually sort of went on this mode out of the need to make a living or to live by or to support their families at home. Think about migrant workers' families having to re-welcome migrants back home in India or Indonesia, whereby you have this bulk of unpaid labor ballooning for women. Yes, they've done that, but should we romanticize that? Well, we should pay for it, that's for sure. So we go back to which forms of policy can actually then sort of tackle these issues.
Okay, I see Professor Kostas Lapovitsas has raised his hand. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Somehow I can't turn the video on. I think you've stopped me from doing it. I
I
tried.
hear you very well, Kostas, though. Hello.
All right.
You should be able to now, Kostas.
I thought I would grace you with my presence.
I would very much love so, but I hear you very well. Here we go.
Okay, there we are. Okay. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's very, very good as expected. So I have a question which I always have whenever the issue of social reproduction comes up. And it's not a question that relates so much to the provision of welfare and neoliberalism and how that affects it, and the care economy or universal basic income or universal basic services. It's not so much that. What troubles me when I think of that is quite different. And social reproduction, in my understanding of it, surely must involve the reproduction of the population as a whole. The ability of the population is understood as an entity to reproduce itself at the same level or at a higher level, whatever it is. Let's discuss how that is. Because if it begins to shrink, then we've got social contraction of this magnitude somehow. Why am I saying this? It's not abstract. It's very concrete. When I look at entire areas of the Balkans, the population is contracting. Huge areas of the Balkans are becoming depopulated. Bulgaria has lost a quarter of its population. Serbia has lost a quarter of its population. The Romanian population is also declining. This isn't just the Balkans. You also see it in the northern peripheries of the European Union. The population of the Baltic countries has shrunk substantially. People cannot live there, right? They cannot live and they leave. But not only in the periphery in that way, other countries which are also peripheral, but not quite as much. For instance, Spain, huge areas of Spain are becoming depopulated, emptied. I mean, I don't know if you've been, but it's a stunning thing about huge parts of Spain. That's an inability to reproduce. Let's call it the population, right? Physically and otherwise. I wonder if the work you've been doing and the kind of economics that has been developed over the last few years around the issues that you've touched upon and introduced. I wonder if they can give us an understanding of that, because I think it's a major issue. In Europe, at any rate, it's a major issue. And if you think of what to propose to these countries, surely you must say something about how to staunch that. You can say all sorts of things about welfare. You can say all sorts of things about growth. But if the Bulgarian population is gone, or the Serbian population has gone down to 6 million people, you understand you've got a problem. And if it goes down to 5, then, or whatever, you've got a problem. So that must be somehow confronted, right? We must have a position on that, because it troubles people. So I wonder if you've got any insight on that. I wonder if you can say something about that, if this aspect of social reproduction.
I think that's an excellent question, but I think social reproduction analysis they produce a vantage point which is quite extraordinary to answer this question. Because if you look at how you'll break down how we regenerate, or what social reproduction entails the regeneration of workers, well, the making of workers. Of course, the biological reproduction entails the regeneration of workers through specific forms of labor. It entails the regeneration of non-worker through specific forms of labor, and so on. When it comes to the debate around populationism as such, we always, and this has been, I have to say, a problem not just for demographers, but also for feminist many feminist analysis, is this obsession with the fertility rates, which you see, well, you mentioned Spain, you mentioned the Balkans. I'm less familiar with the Balkans, I'm more familiar with Spain, but certainly I'm very familiar with Italy, where I come from, where a lot of feminist analyses have gone into trying to tackle the issue of the declining fertility rates. We have similar debates for Japan and so on and so forth. But, you know, what social reproduction analysis allows you to see is that part of that, when you look at the regeneration of life, part of that has to do with biological reproduction, but part of that has to deal with the overall processes through which you regenerate specific people. Now, if I look at, take the example of the Italian debate, the Italian debate, and many feminists, I have to say, within the Italian debate, continue lamenting the low fertility rates, but what they really mean is the low fertility rates of a population that they pitch and represent as the only Italian population that they would see as such, which is this construction of white Italianity, if you want, which we never belonged to in the first place, because Italy has an extraordinary history overall over the construction of sort of the people as Caucasian, which is inaccurate. While instead, at the same time, they operate the politics of closed borders, of militarized visa regimes, and of denial of citizenship even to people that are born in Italy and they spend a big amount of their life in Italy. The ways in which you acquire Italian citizenship is one of the most sort of harsh and rights denying system that you would see. So you have no iure sanguinis. You have only iure sanguinis. You have no iure soli. Even if you're born there, it doesn't mean anything. So you have the debate of populationism, which is completely sort of detached from debates around migrations, debates around citizenship, which instead are crucial. Because to an extent, my crudest answer to you would be, well, if you have a population problem, open the borders. Because we don't only regenerate through making babies, we also regenerate through migration. We regenerate through sort of accepting or diversifying population through the movement of bodies from elsewhere. You can regenerate through guest worker schemes, through welcoming sort of a labor force from outside. In fact, I would say that North America have a very long history of that. Australia has a very long history of that, although not all of that is sort of designed in progressive ways, but there are progressive ways to think in terms of how to solve, if you want to call it that way, a population problem that doesn't become obsessed with the pronatalism, which instead is what we have been obsessed with, also because of the covert racism of many of these debates, at the very least when it comes to Europe,
Okay, I won't, we can discuss that. It's a good answer. We can discuss that on another occasion. That's enough for me now. Thank you.
I hope so. I think you're just at the lower floor from me, so hopefully we can get a coffee soon.
That's right.
Thank you both. Ale, would you like to continue reading and addressing some of the questions in the chat?
Yes, I'm trying to go through the chat.
We can start with Patrick.
In post-crisis.
Yes.
Well, there is a difference between what I would like to see from what I'm seeing, in the sense that, for instance, on our way out, whatever that means, from the pandemic, because as I said, the WHO has never called off the pandemic. So we still live in the pandemic. My father was hospitalized 4 months ago because of COVID. So we just sort of still live in this bubble whereby, of course, we don't die as much, but there's still like a sort of death count that goes on if you look at the WHO website. So in a post-crisis, what we have started talking about, particularly when it comes to women's or like feminist scholarship on policy, was the idea of what Diana Elson has called the caring economy, or, you know, they're just different type of debates and struggles that I was hopeful about. In the US, there was a discussion of the domestic workers' bills in Congress. In Eastern Europe, there was the Constitution of East, this group of that tried to politicize their identity as essential workers to fight through that particular label. And I'm always in favor of reappropriation of labels, wherever they come from, for good purposes. Here we had discussions over sort of expansion in welfare, or like keeping up or keeping measures that we've seen have been rolled in during the pandemic. Sadly, I would say that a year and a half down the line, it seems to me that we are slightly back at business as usual. And instead, I would say that it would be very beneficial to push for the debate to remain what it is on the lessons learned, and how we can instead start from the provision of welfare services, or start from a specific caring aspect of the economy to then build a virtual cycle. So this is the type of system I would like to see. But then, of course, it depends on who wins the election in every place, and that will be our issue very soon. So, you know, I say fingers crossed, but then I don't know what I'm crossing for at the moment in the UK. And that's it. I mean, it depends who you put in government. Now I have Cleodha Ryan. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name too much. Okay. Universal basic services as opposed to income. Yes. Yeah, again, as I said, I think for me, the useful way to sort of map the different social reproduction lenses that explain different parts of this crisis of life that I've been trying to analyze is also that, as I don't think the one only theory can explain everything, right? And we should overcome this idea that you have the meta theory of change that explain all. I like this idea of instead using social reproduction as a lens, and there are multiple theorizations. It's also because there are different policy and political solutions. So I totally agree with you that the provision of universal basic services is a must, and there are people that are doing stellar work here in the UK on that. You can read the work by Lorena Lombardozzi, for instance, on this with Pitts. It's an excellent paper. There are others there just come up with the similar analysis when it comes to India, for instance. But you don't have to see these measures in competition. This is what I'm saying. We're talking about fractions of the budget. So we have socialized this idea, this thinking that we need to choose the one thing that will be crucial for us to revert, instead changing, and the distraction of welfare and of working class lives that we have seen in the last 50 years. Of course, it cannot be done with the measure. So yes, we need to provide real services, but we have to pay people that are not paid for laboring they do, and we need to consider income support in the context, particularly as we transit towards more humane forms of welfare provision. Anna Marie, a question about the role of the state in social reproduction literature seems mostly as mediator. Well, I agree with you to an extent, but I think it's mostly because we're dealing with the neoliberal slim states pretty much everywhere. I mean, in whichever circumstances you want to see it. So instead, by all means, I think we need to reclaim a role of the state, which is far more wide-reaching within the sustenance of societal reproduction. But for that, we need to reclaim welfare provision. We need to really move away from the regime of social reproduction that we have seen instead constituted itself under neoliberalism. And again, what this means in different countries is very different. So what you fight for is very different, but it's like moving away from a process whereby you have communities and households and working class people that have to socialize the losses of welfare. This is why you have a sense that the state is missing, because it has been missing, it has been retreating, and it has sort of generated care gaps over care gaps that then people have to juggle. Ian, that is more of a comment on the zone of wars beyond the border of Fortress Europe. Yes, I don't know if you want to voice your question. Otherwise, I'll totally agree with you. I'm not quite sure that I'll pitch Spain as such an exception, because yes, you do have a left-wing government in Spain, but the level of disfranchisement are massive. So yes, they have dealt with some unemployment, some sort of poverty, but they still they started off from hell, to be honest. So it's still hardly a place that you can consider to be ideal. And the level of homelessness in Spain are quite staggering, if you ask me. Abdelrazak, thank you, Professora. You're just very welcome. Thank you very much. And this is my very own PhD student, I think, Fatima. Yes, of course. We just back on UBI. Yes, the universal basic income is one of those beasts for the left. And I think it's just, but truly, right? Maybe because for much of my life, I worked with very impoverished working communities. I just really wonder who is really against a form of wage or a form of income support for people that actually really struggle around the poverty line or the vulnerability line. Now, the issue is how you can think about universal basic income measures. They are not then turned to be just a cut for capital. So they don't work just a subsidy to then sort of have capital sort of not dealing with minimum wages or living wages, because then at that point, the income disbursement becomes their way to sort of being able not to indicize or like to increase wages. But there are ways to do that. There are ways to control for that. And also what I'd like really to remark is that there is all this debate vis-a-vis basic income versus wage support. But for communities that see their work unremunerated, that they work for free, right? That they just do not receive a wage for the laboring services that they offer. And in some contexts, particularly in the global south, but not only, it's huge work. Think about the work of fetching water or fetching wood in India, which lies outside the computation of what is considered to be employment. It's not domestic work. It has a number attached to that in other places, but instead in India is socialized by women as unpaid labor. Think about Black women community labor in the US to substitute for welfare services. These are forms of labor which is offered for free. When this happens, the distinction between forms of income support and wage provision are just semantics, okay? There is no difference between an income claim and a wage claim for the wageless. For the wageless that reclaims their right to see their laboring remunerated in whichever form. So in this particular sense, what I would like really to invite people in this polarized debate to consider is that might be really fighting a position which is extremely similar to theirs, that ultimately is more ideological than sort of material, the actual differences that you have when it comes to the life experience of many communities.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and thank you everybody for posing their questions.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of look at others, but I can't really see a question.
No, I think we're out of questions, but we're not out of time. So
there is one by Ian that I cannot quite grasp. So I don't know if he wants to ask, if you want to unmute himself, yes, because I find it really difficult to sort of then transform the comment into a question. I wouldn't want to.
Of course.
Interpret.
Ian, you can unmute yourself now.
Hi, thank you. I was just on the immigration thing. I'll just go back up because I know I started writing quite long sentences myself. I may try to summarize it myself. Basically, while standing up for the rights of migrants and opposing the racist pronatalism of the right, which I've seen about Giorgia Meloni's positions before as well, I think we should also be for the societies where these migrants come from, especially beyond Fortress Europe, going back to my previous comment that I think you read out, being able to reproduce themselves and the rights of their people not to migrate, not to have to migrate. And the current situation, I think, is the worst of all worlds, where they're being driven from pillar to post, that their own societies are being made unviable in a lot of ways by wars and economic destruction and other things. And then the immigration policies at this end are becoming ever more hostile, to use the official British term for a time, hostile environment. So it's really grim, but I think we have to do both, defend migrants and make the case that you did, that actually it could solve a lot of these problems that are being problematized too much by the likes of Meloni. But at the same time, people shouldn't have to leave their homes because their homes have become unviable. So just I was just making that comment after your discussion with Costas, just to respond to what you were saying a minute ago about Spain as an exception. I just meant it's not a post-Cold War kind of ex-communist, ex-Stalinist, however you want to put it, state, whereas those other ones that Costas mentioned, I think all were in the Balkans and the Baltic and so on. And that's why I thought about what an indictment of capitalism when in 1989, 90, it was in those kind of places being promoted as something that was particularly to do with democracy and going to lead to a better life. I think, yes, in terms of the Spanish centre-left government, it is in a very precarious situation, and the economy is just as hellish as there, it seems, through the EU and structural adjustment and all that, and the dangerous situation with Vox. But yeah, that's all I was meaning, that in terms of capitalism coming in a almost revolutionary way a generation ago, and now look what's happened. All right, thanks.
Can I add a point to this?
Sure, go ahead, Costas.
Otherwise, I mean, just so that we don't go round and round. I think these are very important points made by Ian. When we approach it in terms of rights, it's interesting to think of the rights of the population that is in one place, the right population that moves in, and so on, in terms of reproduction. The point I wanted to add is this: migration is indeed an interesting thing. If you look at, in this regard, if you look at Britain, population of Britain has increased by 10 million people during the time I've been here. I've been here a long time now, but it's increased by 10 million people, mostly through migration. So the population, the British population, reproduces itself amidst all this by relying on cheap labor from abroad and attracting people from across the world. Less so from continental Europe than it used to, but much less, but from across the world. But if you look at the countries that I mentioned where the population is declining, where there is somehow an issue of social reproduction, it is because of migration. It's not that the Bulgarian population cannot reproduce itself physically. Obviously it can, but it's not that. It's not the natalism or only the birth rate. It's that they migrate en masse. They can't live there. So, migration isn't simply people coming into another place because there's a lot of youth in a place and they've got a lot of children, and somehow the excess population, whatever it is, in the usual schemas you've got, end up in countries which are in Europe, they're not decreasing population. No, that's not how it works. Population migration, as you know very well, Alessandra, happens also from countries which have got very low birth rates, and then the countries empty out. And that really is what's happening in the Balkans and in the Baltics and elsewhere. I mean, London is the third largest, I believe, French city in the world. How does this tie in? Do you see what I mean? We've got to, the rights there have got to be balanced somehow. It is a problem that needs, and I'm saying this politically as well, you've got to be able to have an argument about this when you meet people who are concerned about it. That's all.
Well, I mean, I think the argument that Ian makes is slightly different from the argument vis-a-vis the Balkans. Although, of course, the Balkans' own history, if you want, of depopulation is linked to a number of disruptions and which have a very long history. But for instance, if the argument is we should not bomb countries so that these people then don't come and they don't have reproductive questions, which they don't bring at the border of Europe, then I agree with you. The moment you do, though, you have to allow them in, and by allowing them in, paradoxically, you can actually resolve a lot of issues that you've been lamenting up to now about aging population in Europe and so on and so forth. When I made the example of Italy, is that it's a classic sort of case with a particularly adversarial or harsh anti-migration policy and politics, particularly now with Meloni at the government, why the incoming of migrants could easily solve part of their obsessions with increasing population numbers, because you don't just regenerate by making babies. In relation to the Balkans, I'm not saying that it's not an issue when you have living populations, but these are, I would say, a demographer, how he would answer is just, it's only a longer durée that will tell you in the end what happens. I mean, if you have people living and remitting, for instance, through remittance, you can still have a regeneration of people staying on. So I don't know enough about the Balkans to put forward the strategy that solve the issue. But not only repopulation or forcing people not to leave is the answer at all, because there are a lot of net exporters of people around the globe that through remittances instead are able to regenerate aging people back home. So, I mean, why this doesn't happen for the particular countries you're looking at is something that I cannot really answer because I'm not familiar with that case, but there is a range of possibilities you have, thinking like thinking like a feminist demographer, and without sort of obsessing with pronatalism in a way that is always kind of right-wing. I mean, I have not seen a populationist argument that really sort of is able to be put forward from the left, because it's really dealing with either constraining the movement of people or constraining the actions of people. See the China one-child policy and the horrors that it created, and so on and so forth. So whenever you have either particularly aggressive pronatalist strategies, or when you have instead particularly aggressive anti-immigration or anti-immigration strategies, generally you're dealing with a form of state which is hardly desirable. So think outside the box. I think it's more helpful in terms of instead which progressive experiences you can think of, or which new forms of engagement with this problem you can think of from the left, without being stuck with either compelling people to make life or denying the possibility of other people to make life, as you've seen, like the natalist politics in Israel, which has been indecent for many years, even well before the current moment, with forced sterilization and a number of quite sad happenings there as well. So that would be it on my side.
I think also, perhaps, if I may say, that much depends on the emergence of co-periphery structures as well. And it's well known that if allowed, then the core would attract population from the periphery. Co-periphery in Europe, that's quite clear. It's an internal thing. Never mind the outside thing, but it's an internal thing in Europe. So you'd put across arguments about rebalancing the economy if you wanted to, to confront the issue of depopulation, rebalancing the economy, providing opportunities, recreating an economy whereby people would be able to live where they were born, rather than migrate en masse, go to Germany or whatever else they're going to. One last thing, don't quote me on London being the third biggest city, French city in the world. It certainly is very big. I don't know if it's the third, but it certainly is very big.
I'm told that Toronto is the first Italian, one of the first Italian cities in the world. I don't know, but certainly they're just places that have really welcome massive numbers of people from outside. And to be honest, I really see your point, but I actually think people migrate for all sorts of reasons, and they should always be able to do so, if you ask me. So it just, and I'm, we are, both of us, we epitomize that, right? We both live in London for so many years. I celebrated my 20th last year, so.
Yeah, you're still young when it comes to that, but it's not an argument about stopping migration. This is an argument of how to deal with it as a social phenomenon, which in places it can be destructive. People think of, people in large parts of Europe don't think of what happens where people live. I mean, in some parts of Europe, the emigration is actually not a good thing. It empties the country. You can't find skills. You can't. Anyway, enough is enough.
I think there is a last question on global care chains, which of course is crucial to this discussion. So I hope I made it clear when we dealt with the sort of reorganization of processes of life making in reproductive sectors. So we have seen the escalation of that on a sort of massive scale. And of course, has knock-on effect on processes of cheapening of labor in those specific sectors in importing countries for reproductive workers. So for instance, if you look at nurses' salaries in the UK or in other contexts where, there is this systematic import of reproductive labor, there is an effect on depressing wages, which is quite considerable. And instead, there is a process which Salima Valiani has called the reproductive unequal exchange from the countries in question. And sometimes it's a form of brain drain, then can have very pernicious effects. So for instance, there's a lot of discussion that was on the Lancet on the bad effect that this reproductive exchange, so nurses leaving Africa, parts of Africa for the UK or Europe, on the possibility of some countries to deal with the Ebola crisis, even before COVID, for instance. So totally, I would agree that care chains are a key part of this discussion.
Okay, so I think with that, we can wrap up today's lecture series. Thank you very much, Alessandra. Thank you very much, Darren. And thank you, everybody, for joining, participating, and asking your questions. I just want to briefly remind everyone that our next session will be on the 26th of February by Ying Chen on the climate crisis and the future of capitalism. Like we've been doing so far, the Zoom link will be sent in due time, and you'll receive a couple of reminders for that event as well. So, well, have a good evening and afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.